Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by the WHO IBP Network. The topic today, has the decolonizing global health agenda been colonized? Next slide. My name is Nandita Tate, and I run the IBP Network based at WHO in Geneva, Switzerland. We are thrilled to have all of you with us today. I'm just going to start by giving a brief overview of IBP and how this the genesis of this webinar was started. IBP is a global network, a consortium of over 100 NGOs, civil society organizations, academics, and international partners, as well as 20,000 individuals working in the SRHR, sexual and reproductive health and rights space. We have a mission to support the dissemination and use of evidence-based guidelines and practices in sexual and reproductive health and family planning. One of the things that IBP took on last year was a new strategy. As part of that strategy, we wanted to relook at our efforts around diversity, equity, inclusion, like many other organizations. And we conducted a survey with our wide member base. And what we saw was a huge disconnect in the way global organizations or internationally based in the US, North America, Europe, organizations understand some of these terms and the way our local partners understood and operationalized these terms. And so we wanted to host this webinar to try to have a conversation about some of these really heavy topics around decolonization, diversity, equity, and inclusion. In fact, from the survey, we had a lot of feedback from our local partners that this was very much a North American driven agenda, North American European driven agenda. And one of the comments was even the inspiration for the title, that it almost seems like the decolonization agenda has been colonized. And so that's why we're here today. If you go to the next slide. I'd like to just recognize my colleagues from the WHO IBP Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Team. It's these colleagues that worked on that survey that really helped us come together to develop and design the session today. This might be the first in many, but we are really thrilled to have the session today and happy to have you all with us. Next slide. Very honored to have a number of esteemed colleagues with us as our discussants today. If I can ask our colleagues to just turn on their cameras so they can wave quickly. We'll first hear from Dr. Lata Narayanaswamy from University of Leeds, who will provide an overview of coloniality, some of the implications for global health. We'll then hear from our colleague Angela Bruce-Raeburn to talk a little bit about intersectionality and challenges when addressing these issues when working in global organizations and local organizations. Our third panelist will be Dr. Eliya Zulu from the African Institute for Development Policy. And he will be talking about really operationalizing DEI and decolonization in practice. What does this really look like? Is it possible and is it working? What more do we need to do? And finally, we will hear from Anup Adhikari from SURUWAT, Nepal, a local organization working with indigenous and marginalized communities in Nepal. And he will talk about really what does this mean at a very local level. There's a lot of push around DEI and decolonization, but what does that mean when you're working in a country context in rural Nepal? So with that, we'll go to the next slide, just a few housekeeping things. Remember that the webinar will be recorded. So for those who cannot stay the entire time or cannot join us live, we will post the recording on the YouTube channel for WHO HRP. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom to submit questions anytime. We have intentionally left a lot of time for questions because we want this to be a discussion. And so our panelists will be looking at questions, try to answer them in real time via the chat, but we will also be able to follow up with you afterwards if we don't get a chance to address all of them during the webinar. And finally, we've left the chat open, which is a little bit of a different model than our typical webinar. And that was intentional because we want this to be a discussion. So we ask that you be direct, be honest in your feelings and thoughts about what you hear, share with each other communicate with each other, we just ask that you please be respectful. Remember, we are all here to learn. I do want to just caveat by saying I am not an expert in this area. I'm coming at this topic with a level of vulnerability and eagerness to learn. This is something that has been brought to our attention over and over through our partners through IBP, and we see our role as IBP is to really provide that global platform. Given our position at WHO, at IBP, we have the ability to provide a global platform for these local experiences to be amplified and shared. And that's what we want to do today. That's our role. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. And I'm thrilled to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lata Narayanaswamy from University of Leeds. She's an associate professor in the politics of global development at University of Leeds. You can see her bio there. And Lata, I'll turn it over to you. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Nandita. Thank you to all of you who have joined us today and made time for this important discussion. And I mean, the starting point would really be, if we were really to talk about decolonizing, I'd want to start by saying that we really need to challenge the idea of expertise. So I don't come to you today thinking of myself as an expert at all. It's quite the opposite. I've had the luxury of some time to think through some of these issues. I'd like to share some of my insights, but I come from a particular position, a particular context with my own set of ideas, and we're here today to listen, to learn, and to engage. And also to work through these issues together. But in order to set a context for our discussion, next slide, please. I wanted to at least start with some historical and critical reflections on why we're even having this discussion around decolonization and the global health agenda. There's a trigger warning here. There are some upsetting images in this presentation. I don't use them lightly, but in a way, coloniality is very much the underpinning set of ideas of the systems that we work in. It's the very air we breathe, and it's a shared concern. And I also think we need to confront honestly what we're talking about when we talk about colonial legacies. But I apologize in advance if this is upsetting. I have been in contexts where actually people need to leave the room. If that's the case, please turn it off, move away. I'm happy to hang on at the end if anybody would like to talk through any of these, as I always offer to anyone involved in sessions that I'm a part of. But I wanted to put that out there. As I said, I appreciate it's upsetting, but I wanted to be upfront about why I think that's important. Okay, so with that in mind, next slide, please. This is a whistle stop. I've got about 5 or so minutes, and I can't do justice to the depth of conversation that we need to have around this. But I wanted to start with just some basics. I don't like to presume a lot of prior knowledge, but these are the core sort of takeaway messages that I'd love for us to start with, to start this discussion. Decolonization is a process, not an outcome. So I hope this is the start of that journey, and I'm privileged to be here. Appreciate the invitation to be a part of your journey on these questions. So for me, one important takeaway message is that colonialism has irredeemably shaped the world. Now, for me, this is about, we can narrow this down to thinking about European colonialism. That's the shared history. That's what's being captured in these images. We mustn't shy away from confronting the horror of what European coloniality undertook as part of upholding European empire for over 500 years. But for me, if I had one message for all of you to take away today, it is that we mustn't see, in the context of global development, our instinct is to talk about this place, which we tend very often, not necessarily by design, but to talk in homogenous ways about the global South. And then decoloniality has increasingly been this thing that we're talking about in order to do something that relates to global development in the global South. And here, my takeaway message would be that we need to stop thinking about colonialism as just the story of the black and brown other living in places distant from Europe and North America. The starting point for me is that colonialism is our story. Absolutely everybody on this planet has some link to colonialism. We must recognize the continuities then in how coloniality shapes the way we know the world. Now, that can be a historical lens, absolutely, but we also need to think about the ways in which we continue to be underpinned by coloniality more broadly. In other words, the sorts of extractive capitalist relations, if I can use that term, shape the way we live now. They may have their historical basis in European colonialism, but we still live with that coloniality today. That's really important. So then if we can think about what the language of decolonization might mean, and here I'm drawing on the words of the Decolonizing LSE Collective in 2019, which I think is it's an excellent summary. Calls to decolonize, they argued, are about recognizing, making visible, and working to address the legacies that colonialism, empire, racism, and patriarchy continue to have, and envisioning a world beyond these repressive structures. Next slide, please. Now, one of the ways in which we can think then about this is to understand the different lenses and tools that might help us to make sense of this space. I think when we talk about European colonialism, that feels really big. It feels unwieldy and frankly, not unreasonably, quite overwhelming, right? Where do I start? One of the things that I think can be very helpful then is to come together to talk about difference and the ways in which the differences that we live with are also shaped by coloniality. So intersectionality is one of those terms. It gets used quite a lot, but here what we want to do is to understand the existence and experiences of the effects of oppressive structures that I just introduced in that definition. So talking about patriarchy, talking about coloniality. When we think about our different axes of identity, how do then those what can be oppressive structures, how are we experiencing them in relation to the coloniality that underpins the systems we live in? So intersectionality is one of those terms that's potentially really useful. Now here I've got a nice little Venn diagram. It's not exhaustive. We are both we are the same, but also differentiated by many types of axes of difference. But what we don't want to do is to do a counting exercise where you say, okay, so I'm a woman and then I am, so in my case, I'm a woman and I'm brown and I'm sort of trying to layer on notions of disadvantage. That's not what intersectionality is about. Intersectionality is about elements of identity that are intertwined and co-constitutive. That just means that they exist in us at the same time. So they don't add up to a cumulative burden. For Kimberly Crenshaw, who came up with this idea, this was really important for her to be clear about. It's rather about understanding how the differences that we exist with shape our unique experiences of oppression or exclusion, or indeed about inclusion, about the hierarchies that exist and shape the way that we live. Next slide, please. Now, there's lots of ways that we can think then about what this has to do with public health. And there's lots of other areas that it affects. But in my sort of now, I guess what's amounting to another sort of 2 to 3 minutes, I want us to think then about what this means for us in terms of global public.
Oh, sorry. I think, Lata, are you still there?
Yes, I am.
Sorry, I think I'm not sure if it froze for everyone, but maybe just if you can just start again on this slide, it may have frozen for some folks.
Oh, okay. Maybe that was me. I'm not sure. Oh dear.
Go ahead. Just yeah, if you can just start over from this slide, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, sorry. I apologize if that was my internet connection. So what basically all I was trying to say is there's lots and lots of ways that we can then apply an intersectional lens to think through the effects of coloniality, right? So that's sort of these very fancy social science ways that terminologies that we might use, but they are actually trying to describe not simple things, but they are not necessarily difficult to understand. We can apply that in lots of ways. We can think about gender, we can think about race, we can think about class. I'd like to take all of those intersectional differences and think through how we understand those legacies in health. So what does it mean to look at the experiences of inequality through the lens of coloniality? So we can think about that in relation to health. And what I'd started to say, and maybe this is where I got cut off, is I don't think we should be thinking about decolonizing as completely erasing where we are. We can't erase the history. And also Western medicine, and Western I use in a very loose way here, but this thing that we might call Western medicine has done some remarkable things. But that is rooted in a shared history that we need to be honest about. So the first thing we can think historically in relation to coloniality is eugenics, or what we know as race science. So this was a branch of what was thought of as science, which were post hoc justifications for racial difference, and also about establishing the best genes. So the Nazis then took that to its absolutely gruesome conclusion in the Holocaust, but it was the same set of ideas that led to this sense that we could either breed a master race, but also that it meant that everybody else was somehow less or subhuman. Now, we can also think in relation to medical experimentation. So yes, we need to experiment, we need to work out what treatments work, all of that's true. But the history of some of what we now have come to rely on in what we might call medicine is actually based on historical experimental treatments that were done disproportionately on the bodies of both the poor, so the European, and in the case of British imperialism, Victorian poor, but also the enslaved in the colonies. So slaves as guinea pigs for smallpox experimentation, for instance, in rural Jamaica in the 1760s. And if we think that somehow this is a historical phenomenon, I would draw your attention to a conversation that happened during COVID, right? So this is like 2 years ago. The head of the intensive care unit at the Cochin Hospital in Paris, Jean-Paul Mirat, was quoted on French national television. I believe he said it in French, but this is the translation. Talking about testing drugs to treat COVID, he sort of said, it may be provocative. Should we not do this study in Africa? So again, the language of Africa as this homogenous place rather than an incredibly diverse continent. Should we not do this study in Africa where there are no masks, no treatment or intensive care? A little bit like it's been done for certain AIDS studies, where among prostitutes we try things because we know that they are highly exposed and don't protect themselves. So the deeply unethical language here, but also the suggestion that actually all these people that might be involved in this COVID drug trial, they're not even being given the recognition of their basic humanity. So we still have these tendencies today. This is highly gendered, the language of prostitutes, but also racialized, thinking about Africa. There's also a tendency to think in technological terms, and we can see this with COVID, the rollout of the vaccine. We're not interested in prevention, we're looking for the technology to save us, but also the erasure of the history of taking plants, for instance. The colonizers would take plants from the New World and turning that stuff into medicine in ways that lots of indigenous communities were already doing. We don't acknowledge the debt that we have to those communities for showing what is now modern medicine, the use of those plants and those contributions. And then drugs and again, vaccines is a good example, as opposed to prevention, support, thinking about the World Health Organization's plea for thinking about the wider determinants of health in 2008 with the Commission. There's also a tendency of individualization, focused on individual well-being. We're very bad in many ways of thinking about relationality in public health, i.e. we are connected to each other. So it's not just about my health, but my health depends on your health, depends on my community's health. So there's a tendency, I think global public health agendas have a value in trying to shift the lens on that, but we have to confront that tendency as well, which is also substantially rooted in the technocratic approach that we have to global health, which is part of that colonial legacy. And of course, interventionists. So you call the doctor as part of expectations of health, divorced from a wider context. How do we situate our understanding of global health within this context? How do we recognize the continuity of that colonial experience? And then what do we now collectively do about that coloniality? That, for me, is the start of our conversation about what decolonizing global public health means. I'm going to stop there. I think I've taken up too much time. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Back to you, Nandita. Thank you.
Thank you, Lata. That was excellent and really provided a great overview. I think, especially, I know many of us were using these terms, throwing them around, hearing about them, reading about them, but I think setting that stage, that historical perspective is excellent. Coloniality is our story, all of us. And so we all have a responsibility to address these power dynamics. I also appreciate you reminding us that, you know, these medical experimentation that happened so many years ago, issues around eugenics, there's still issues that are happening today. So this is not something that is just happened in the past that we must, you know, we need to acknowledge our role in some of that that's still ongoing today, whether it's in research, whether it's the way we design programs, where we design programs, who we design them for, and for what purpose. And certainly in sexual and reproductive health and family planning, especially, we need to be cognizant of some of these issues. Thank you again, Lata, for your excellent presentation. I would like to now turn to our next presenter, Angela Bruce-Raeburn. She has her own boutique consulting company, DiverseDev, does a lot of work around diversity, equity, inclusion, working with international organizations, local organizations. I will say that Angela has been working with us, with IBP, for the past year. We really appreciate her expertise, and Angela, look forward to having you share your perspective working in this space, specifically between international organizations and the differences that you've seen working at a local level. Angela, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Morning. Thank you, Ados, for sharing the slides. If we could just, if I could just start with, to come off of what Dr. Lata just talked about. We are not in this conversation about global development by accident. We're not in a conversation about international development, about how we work, we meaning how international NGOs and big donors like USAID and these organizations, how they end up working in these parts of the world, that is those other places far away from us. It's not by accident. It is connected exactly to what Dr. Lata is just talking about in terms of how we were shaped by colonialism. Development comes as a result of this empire of colonialism that we have lived out over the last 500 years. These nations were impoverished through colonialism. They are in constant need because of the legacy of colonialism, the extraction, the way that so much was taken away from these countries. So now we have to develop them, right? So in comes the international development, global development agenda. Big organizations coming into these small countries all over the world. And we're here with our expertise. We come with our metrics and our data and our log frames and all the things that we come with, and our experts. And we descend into these parts of the world where we have no understanding or no context for these people, their lived experiences. Why are they doing this versus that? And we say to them, here's what we need to do. And we're going to give you money to do this tiny sliver of things, right? We're going to allow you to implement a project. We won't allow you to conceptualize the project, right? So global development is a very specific sort of extension of what the Dr. Lata was just talking about. And I think oftentimes we are in this conversation without even the ability to really reflect and understand why. Why are we talking about it in this way? So next slide, please, Ados. So the way this diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda, right, that we are discussing, and how we're not talking about it again in a vacuum. We're talking about it because it's coming from a space. I put these definitions just to give us a little bit of a baseline from where we can jump off, right? Because recognizing that we are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion because we know that within the context of global development, there are gross inequities and disparities ranging from the way international organizations are led, funded, what they decide to do in terms of the work that they're doing in these countries, that there's these inequities across the board, right? So diversity, I just want to say it's not only race, but race is a central component of this conversation, right? And gender and religion and sexual orientation and ethnicity. This diversity that we keep talking about, there's a place for us to understand where it's coming from. Why are we asking about diversity? Equity, promoting justice, impartiality, fairness, right? But at the end of all of this must lead to inclusion. So it's great to have diversity, but these people that we are sort of bringing in for representation purposes, what are they there for? Are they there to just check your little box to say, hey, we got diversity? But these people have no ability to be connected to the organization, to be able to make decisions. They don't feel included. Oftentimes, people in these organizations are just there, right? And how is that connected to the decolonization? Just go back to what Dr. Lata was just talking about. Because we are shaped by colonialization, because we are shaped by coloniality, we are now having to sort of deprogram ourselves. I say deprogram, right? Deprogram, decolonize, right? Because that's essentially what we're talking about, right? And I'm going to lastly just throw in there localization, just to, when we get to the next slide, to just say this conversation around DEI, there's all these interchangeable terms with DEI, right? We're throwing localization in there because we know that organizations are saying, like USAID, for example, saying, you know, we need to increase the leadership of local institutions, and we need more local ownership over decision-making, because now the recognition is that we are working in these contexts in which we have no clue. We are clueless, right? So there's been this sort of interchangeable use of words, and I just wanted to offer these brief descriptions, recognizing that it's not exhaustive, right? Okay, but then, next slide, please, Ados. But now, so we got to ask this question: what's going on with DEI? This whole diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda, is it a brand wash? Is it sort of like a little bit of using a paintbrush to wipe over, you know, all of the bad work that we've been doing in development, and now we're saying we're going to use DEI to rebrand, to fix it, right? I don't know, is it? But I think that's kind of what it is, right? If we really want to be honest. So I just want to give you just a little snippet about how we can think about DEI within the context of what Dr. Lata was just talking about, right? Because I feel like we never understand the linkages in this work. We don't understand why we're here. We don't understand how to look back from where we came from, and also what's happening right now and what's coming towards us, right? So just to say, this DEI agenda, it got sort of a big deal in 2020. If you remember, on the heels of Me Too, we had the murder of George Floyd, the pandemic, Black Lives Matter. Now, I want to just say, I know there are a lot of people on here who do not live in the US and may say, but what does that have to do with us? And I want to just say, let me explain why I included that. Because the conversation got amplified after this, the murder of George Floyd in the US, not because he was the first Black man to be killed by the police, nor will he be the last, but because of the way the combination of this murder of this man in this heinous way, this heinous public way, the protests, the racial protests that sort of galvanized across the country and in other parts of the world. And at the same time, we were dealing with our pandemic. And we were dealing with the vaccine rollout there, and we were talking about health inequities. So all of this were happening around the same time. And then we saw this movement towards this thing that I like to refer to as hashtag activism, right? You all remember it. All the international organizations, hashtag George Floyd, hashtag BLM, hashtag we support Black people, right? Right? All these things, we're in solidarity with Black people. All these things were happening, right? And so that sort of moment, I feel, is a thread to kind of explain this sort of amplification of the DEI agenda. But when you're talking about DEI in a global context, when you step outside the US, when you step outside of Europe, you have people in different parts of Africa and Asia asking, what does that got to do with us? We don't understand this thing, right? Buzzwords, DEI, what is that? And so the idea of this webinar today, you know, this question about have we been co-opted? Has this decolonizing agenda been co-opted by all of these buzzwords? You know, DEI, equity, blah, blah, blah. And you all know, we work in international development. You all know we love buzzwords, right? Because it's a way for us to, you know, remain exclusive and keep our, you know, our jargon to ourselves, right? Right? So the amplification of this happened right around this moment. But then when you go into some other parts of the world, people are challenging you. Well, what's DEI? What's it got to do with us? Next slide, please, Ados. And then I'm going to end and allow my next colleague. So let me just tell you how I've been thinking about framing DEI outside of the global north, right? When I've been traveling in Africa and in the Caribbean, where I'm from, I hear, you know, people saying, what is this DEI thing? It seems to me it's about American racism, especially America's tragic past that involving African Americans versus white Americans. I heard that even very recently in places like Togo and places like Trinidad and in places like Cote d'Ivoire. I've heard this, right? Or people saying things like, we don't have a DEI issue. We're all the same people here. We're all Africans, or we're all Black, or we're all Caribbean people. So let me just give you a little bit of a way to maybe allow this conversation to play itself out. Maybe the current narrative that DEI is a global north issue can be reframed. Because of course it's been framed as a global north issue, but how can we reframe it? I will humbly put out to you these to ask organizations, especially organizations like IBP, for example, working, you know, through WHO in a sort of a westernized context, but working with partners in many parts of the world, to look at the question of, well, maybe we're not going to be focused so much on racism, but can we consider diversity in all its forms? What does the organization look like in whatever part of the world we're talking about, right? What does the gender lens look like? How are women represented and how do women work in these organizations, as an example? What about ethnicity? What about language? What about religion? How do we look at these intersectionalities? And how do these intersectionalities come out in these organizations? Because if we reframe it to kind of get a better sense of what these organizations, how people work in these organizations, we might realize that when you say we don't have a DEI problem, maybe you do not have a question of a racism issue, but maybe your your ability to consider other ethnicities in your organization. When you look at some of these organizations, you see there's certain groups that have been able to break out and have, you know, extraordinary leadership power and representation, whereas there are other groups that do not. There are other groups within the same context of these countries which are marginalized. So I will end by asking us to open up our thinking around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to ask beyond racism or beyond race, what other areas can you bring equity into your organization, and how that matters when we are looking from some of these countries towards how DEI is playing out, coming from your donors and bigger sort of organizations outside of the countries in which we're working. Right? And that's just a small piece of how we can think about it, and how to reframe this discussion around DEI, and to move it away from this notion that it's only a North American thing, because I don't really believe that it is. Equity and fairness is not relegated to North America, right? And I think that we working in other parts of the world should be able to expand our thinking about what this might look like. And I was the last slide. So I will stop there. Thank you, Nandita, for this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Angela. That was really inspiring. Again, we love your passion and really making us think. You know, we are not here by accident. I love that line. And really, maybe we do need to deprogram ourselves. A different way of thinking is maybe what is needed. And of course, DEI is more than just race. We're talking about ethnicity, gender, accessibility, colorism, someone mentioned in the chat. There are many ways to address these issues that are applicable across settings, and we need to think deeper about how we do that. Thank you so much again. I'd like to move now to Dr. Eliya Zulu from the African Institute for Development Policy, AFIDEP. He's based in Malawi. Dr. Zulu has over 20 years of experience developing and managing research, capacity building, policy engagement programs on a wide range of issues. And we'd like Eliya to talk a little bit about how does this look in practice? As a regional organization, AFIDEP, you are doing a lot of work with global institutions, receiving a lot of donor funding. So how does this idea of decolonization really look in practice? Is it possible? Does it work? And what are the challenges? So Eliya, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
All right. Thanks a lot, Nandita, for that intro, and my fellow panelists for the insights that you put on the table a lot. I'm really glad to be part of this discussion. I work at AFIDEP. We are an African-led regional African institution whose mandate is to promote use of evidence in public policy formulation and implementation. We are 12 years old. And I think when you look at the history over the last 2 decades or so, you can say to a large extent that our story, the AFIDEP story, it really fits the theme of what we are trying to discuss here, because we are an organization that moved then from an organization that didn't get formed by a big, say, grant that was there to form the organization. A very small seed grant was put there. It was really just like a startup, a typical startup, but it's grown to a level where now we have 80 staff, about close to 18 PhDs and so on, doing very exciting work across the continent, and having shifted from the early days when we were chasing consultancies from the international, the big international NGOs just to survive as an organization, now to a level where we are actually leading some globally competitive programs by organizations, whether it's FCDO, USAID, and other funders, the Gates Foundation, and so on. So really, when you look at this issue about decolonization, there are several key things that we need to look at, or how people talk about it. There's the issue about representation. To what extent are people from the global south actually sitting in these global frameworks that are making big decisions on resources, on what gets done in the global health fraternity. There's an issue about increasing direct funding to southern institutions. About 7-8 years ago, I remember going to some of the big US foundations trying to pursue funding for some work that we do in Africa, and being told quite clearly that you need to go to this specific American university. They are the ones, if they are convinced on your ideas and how the ideas will complement what they are doing, then we'll consider it. So we are coming from there. They saw the issue about breaking that, and the whole point about localization that has come up in terms of increasing direct funding to African organizations is a very key aspect of this. The third point is really the issue about increasing publications by southern institutions, not just symbolic publications where you tag on names. Are people leading in these journal publications and so on? The other aspect is at what extent are we making sure that the whole process of influencing policy processes or informing policy processes with evidence and so on in the global south is really being led by southern experts. The big global organizations or entities, whether it's the UN, the World Bank, and so on, are they the ones when they sit with the ministries really having a bigger say in what our governments are doing, and the voices of the locals are not being heard at all? The other issue is, related to that is the participation, but also the production of the actual evidence. I think if you look at the issue about global representation, I'll just make reference to the Global 50-50. Many of you might have heard about this, the Global 50-50 report on global governance, where they looked at, when you look at all the major global health boards around the world, whether it's Global Fund, even WHO and so on, who are represented in these boards? These are the boards that make the big decisions. 75% of them come from high-income countries. From the US alone, 44% of the whole membership of people in the global health. The UK, about 7%. 25% so are coming from low and middle income countries. But if you look at the low income countries, only 2.5%, yet a lot of the issues to do with global health are focusing on these countries. So when you talk about decolonizing global health or decolonizing science and so on, you can just see there that at the decision-making level, already we have a very long way to go. The issue about direct funding, and that's what Nandita was saying, you know, I should talk about. Right now, as AFIDEP, we've grown really to a level where we are competing for grants that are being competed for globally, but also having discussions with a lot of the foundations that in the past were only funding African organizations through northern institutions. So the whole concept of localization, you look at USAID, whether it's other foundations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Children Investment Fund Foundation, MasterCard, they have not only decided that now they have to strengthen the capacities of African institutions and fund them directly, but many of them have even set shops, regional offices. MasterCard even has their global office in Kigali now. So this is a very positive movement because there's no question that we can't really talk about decolonization, let alone talk about achieving sustainable development in the global south in Africa, if African experts don't take charge, don't own and take charge of resolving these issues. But I think despite this progress, we know that the playing field is still not very level. That in many cases, a lot of these grants, they are arbitrarily sort of overhead rates that are imposed on African institutions. We can only pay you 7%, 10% maximum. A lot of the organizations don't have unrestricted funding, core support. And you can't really build organizations on the basis of project support. That is not even paying full cost of doing business by paying you the full overhead cost. So as we talk about all these issues, we can't just be talking about, okay, for instance, now USAID is talking about 25% of all their funding needs to be spent by local organizations. I think if you don't address these issues, you are not going to have many strong enough local organizations that that can compete and you can even fund. So the funding architecture needs to change. I mean, it's really quite, and when a lot of the organizations are doing capacity building in Africa, it's not just the funders. We have to ask ourselves the question, are we building capacity in a way that we are prepared to close shop? Because we'll get to a point where the governments can do this technical work on their own, or the local experts can actually support their governments because we've helped them to get that, or are we just touching the surface in the name of building capacity, knowing that, you know, we still have to be in business 20, 30, 50, 100 years from now and be part of this process? Are we the ones who are propagating the problems that the southern governments and institutions are facing, or are you part of the solution? I think that needs to be looked at very, very seriously. So for us, we have now, like at AFIDEP, a global grant. We're the first African organization to be given a globally competitive grant where we're the prime, but issued by the USAID's Department of Population and Reproductive Health. And I think some of these issues that we are talking about, the restrictions on overhead and so on, are issues that we are still discussing. But I think it's empowering for a southern organization to have this responsibility. But I think just as this is happening, one result of this process is that a lot of the big international organizations are coming to southern institutions to try to form partnerships. I can tell you for a fact that 7, 8, 10 years ago, after we formed AFIDEP, going to a lot of these organizations to say, we want to get into a proposal with you as a partner, not you to come to us after you've gotten the funding and just use us as your consultants just to facilitate the implementation of your work. A lot of them were saying no, but now, partly because they are being forced by what the funders are saying, but also because our organizations have strengthened over time, you see that many of them are coming, but you can't believe what we still experience. Even just this year alone, we got into 2 big proposals with one UK organization, one US organization, where we've been brought in, we said we can't go with you if we are not a full partner on this, and so we agree on that. But still, organizations are working with this colonial mindset where you can't see the full proposal that has been written. You only are asked to contribute some content to a section regarding what you are going to do. You don't see the full picture. So how can you be talking about decolonizing science when at conceptualization level you are not allowing people to do that? So I think this is critical. In summary, I'll just say here that I think there's a lot that is happening, a bit of positives, but the whole concept of decolonization is really happening from the mindset. African organizations, we've been fighting this. It's the West that is coming into this. I know somebody asked the question, why are some of the colonized not leading the decolonization agenda? We've been fighting this. I think it's the West that is coming in, and I think the West needs to come in with a different mindset. There has to be a concept of neutrality, not just, oh, now we've included you on the table. And the funding mechanisms, as I've said, have to change. You have to build institutions. You can't build institutions out of the sort of restrictions that we see. I'll stop there, and Nandita, and hope to hear now from the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliya. That was excellent and really fascinating to hear some of the really practical and operationalized ways that we can address some of these issues, but also how they're not actually being addressed. So yes, there's more funding going to local organizations, but there are still inequities in the amount of overhead or the use of unrestricted funds, or there's still inequities in how that power is being shared, let's say. Thank you so much. That was really excellent. I'd like to move to our last speaker, Anup Adhikari from SURUWAT, Nepal. He's a trained demographer working with marginalized and indigenous populations in Nepal, and is going to speak about how some of these topics resonate on a really local level in Nepal. Many of our panelists have alluded to this, that it feels like this is all of a sudden a North American Western priority. As Eliya said, people have been working on this for decades. It's just now that a lot of North Americans are coming to the realization that this is an issue. That said, how do these issues resonate when you're working at a really local level in a much more local context? So Anup, let's turn it over to you. We have about 10 minutes. We do want to leave time for questions, but would love to hear what you have to say. So Anup, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Nanta. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. This issue is new for everyone. We are talking in Western and other continent more focusedly, not in South Asian continent, South Asian regions. It is the perspective how we are working in a social side, social organization in a community level, as well as the engaging the indigenous people. Previous speaker speak about the different issues and agenda and the terminology used, where there is a engagement, involvement, and different power reasoning issues are there. In Nepal is also the landlocked country in between China and India. But all the social work activities is driven from the Western regions. Next slide, please. The issue is starting from the social concept, social behavior is starting to develop human resource, human capital, develop professionalism in the development sector. But later on, it is basically focus on the development human resource, human power for working in an NGO and non-governmental organization and the international non-governmental organization. It is clear that people are shifting, only working, focus on not working for the development sectors, including health as well as non-health sectors. The term where we need to focus about the indigenous perspective, the term colonizing and decolonizing perspective, we need to respect the indigenous perspective, indigenous practice, indigenous feeling. The country specific indigenous perspective are there. People are working for their perspective, for their work, for their betterment. But different agency, different donor agency are giving their power, giving their fund for their perspective. Sometimes they are working with the interest of their, but not for the local context. So we need to focus on the indigenous perspective. We are going backward and changing our society and blaming with this, we are going to westernize our country, but where we are respecting and involving indigenous people. They are the native one. They are the first people. They are the land. They need to work for, and they are working for them. So we need to work for involving, in engaging with them, with the social sector in the health as well as the development sectors. The country in the transitional phase, there is a different issues are focused on that, and we need to accept and change different political and ecological changes. Next slide, please. And the social work, we are engaging the voice, and we need to focus on our work, people-centered development perspective. But we are focusing founder development perspective. People are focusing their what the donor agency are doing and what donor agency are required and what they are involving. But where and when we need to focus our local perspective, local need, local how local people are needing. Just like example in different sectors. In education, people are demanding one issues, but people are talking about the different issues. Just like Nepali language is a must. Nepali people are thinking, and Nepali perspective, life skill based education is demanding, but people are thinking about the math, science, and other subjects, which focusing on the local context and local need is also we need to prioritize. In this context, we are not engaging the lots of people due to the different political and structural changes. Is demand from the country and is demand from the local people, the structural economy are not properly presented, properly restructured, depending upon the different situations. And we are linking only different transition through India, though we are not linking in a globalized perspective. We are in local perspective, which is imposed by the different donor agencies. The social work and practice education, we need to focus on decolonizing perspective where our agenda are submerged and our demand is not fulfilled. So we need to bring the issues highlighting everyone perspective. People who are living and they are love for their country are not engaging with the people. Right now, the people are learning, young people are learning and taking educations, and we ask them, what is your future plan? They say, we need to go in Western country, just like outside the country, and engaging and involved there for their perspectives, but not focusing on the localized context. They are not involved in local activity, local phenomena, local perspective, and their involvement is marginalized. Political issues are going on, politically, constitutionally marginalized people, ethnically background people are encouraged to involve in. But these all are in the practice, all are in the document, not in practice. All are document well written from the perspective of different agencies, not involving the local authority and entities. Just for example, in the health sectors, globally, different agency, different network are decided to involve as per the country's need and plan policy. They are ready for the implementation of the program. But these plan policy are written by the international agency, not by the local authority. And what they written, they work on that agenda. That is not highlighting that they are not supporting to solve the local priority, local need, local problem. But they are imposing, we are mandated to only work that issues. So our indigenous perspective, indigenous feeling, indigenous practice are gone away. And we are focusing different agencies, issues, and highlighting that those agencies. As a working in a local level, local organization, we need to sustain in the development for the country level perspective. But we are not able to do as we want, but we are doing as others want. So next slide, please. So at last, the USA, just a different example is coming on from the different speaker also. They are focusing on the need and issues. The USAID is a major funder for the development sector in health and education development sector in Nepal, but they are not supporting the safe abortion practice. And after before the legalization of abortion in Nepal, maternal mortality is high. Maternal mortality is high, and after legalization process, maternal mortality is slightly support for reducing the maternal mortality after legalization of abortion. But the USAID mandate that they are not able to support safe abortion, but they are working for the different agencies. So this is the one major issue that is for local need. The donor agency, donor funder agency, donor agency are not working in the local context and not respecting the local. It is the colonization perspective or decolonization perspective where we are moving. We are focusing on the decolonization perspective, but indirectly the local agencies are funding, falling under the colonization perspective. Okay, thank you. Other issues are coming on. If there is any questions and issues, we are ready for the discussion. Thank you. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anup. That was really, really insightful and really, a good reminder that, what we're really talking about is, are we really meeting the needs of local people in this global development work? And I think it strikes me that a big issue that we haven't addressed really is the funding architecture. And Eliya, everyone has alluded to that. And I think we don't have very much time left. We're actually at time, but I do want to give our panelists time to respond to at least this question that has come up over and over. You know, what do we do about this funding relationship? Because it does seem like a lot of what's driving the agendas are donor priorities. And how do we shift that mindset? There's been a lot of work recently on trust-based philanthropies. Some questions came online about that. Really just giving unrestricted funding, trusting local organizations to do what they need to do with that funding. We see that with Mackenzie Bezos, for example. So let me give our panelists 1 or 2 minutes to just close and really try to sort of touch on that issue, because I think that is probably one of the biggest challenges if we're really going to try and address these issues, is the funding. So let me go to Lata first, and I'll give each of you maybe about a minute, and then we can wrap up. Thanks to those of you who are online. If you can stay a few minutes to hear from our panelists, we'd appreciate it.
Thanks, and thank you to all of my fellow panelists. That's been really illuminating. I mean, just on the point of funding, I can't help but feel that focusing on funding as a sort of, can we spend the money better, maybe slightly the wrong focus, in the sense that we do need a collective effort to have a different conversation about resource distribution. So whether that's the kinds of conversations that are happening at COP27 around loss and damage, for instance, or how we come together to make demands about resource distribution. So thinking about reparations for, colonialism and slavery. I'm not saying that solves a problem now, but I would like for us collectively to reflect on what it would look like for us to come together and make different demands about resource distribution. But equally, I think there's lots and lots of really fantastic chat going on about the challenges that funding creates. And obviously, some people saying we need another event, and I couldn't agree more. But I would like for us to brainstorm about the structural constraints and what coming together to demand a different distributional settlement for funding would look like. I think I'll leave it there. And thanks so much to everybody.
Hi, thank you. Quickly, there's some really amazing comments in the chat. I just noticed someone said, we can't truly decolonize if we're always asking for money and funding from some of the same people who colonized and, raped and pillaged across the globe, which is a fair point. But I will say this, we talk about funding as philanthropy, as sort of what's the word? That model of altruism. If we want to get honest and truthful, it's not altruism. I'll call it reparations. Let's call it that. I know it's going to make some people uncomfortable, right? Because we know the debate around reparations. But when Dr. Lata started this conversation, she was talking about, she was showing how we are living the legacy of colonialism every day in the way that we're even discussing global development. So maybe we need to get out of deprogram ourselves around the way we are approaching conversations around funding. We're always talking about it like altruism, and we're giving out of the goodness of our hearts. But at the end of the day, many of these nations are impoverished, and many of the nations that we live in the global north is the rich nations because of the impoverishment of other nations. So at the end of the day, some of this conversation need to get downright open and honest and truthful, and examining how we have come to the conversation around funding. And maybe we don't need to be so, come to it with such a way of, we're writing a grant, we're asking for money. Maybe it's not that. Maybe we need to blow up that whole system. And I know some people may not like that, but Nandita, I'm out. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Angela. Eliya, let me go to you.
Thanks, Nandita. I think for me, I'll just say, I think the comment that somebody said about that there's need for local funding. Part of the work that we do at AFIDEP is actually to make sure that we work with parliamentarians, we get senior researchers to make sure that they also advocate for increased funding in research and technical assistance. So there's no question that that has to be done, and otherwise, I mean, we tell our governments their agenda will be set outside our countries. But I think to the extent that the money is out there to be spent on global development, the point we are saying is that even the northern institutions that are getting the money, they're getting the money to work in Africa, and you're just going to be spending the money endlessly without having impact. You cannot have impact without empowering and making sure that local governments and local experts and local institutions are strong enough to engage with the government so that they become less reliant on the global north on this funding. So that's what I would say there, that yeah, it's a critical thing that we have to increase local funding, but at the same time, the architecture has to change to make sure that the donors are enforcing neutrality in the way the work is actually done. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliya. And Anup, I'll go to you for just a minute of reflection.
Okay, thank you everyone. I'm going with the chat. There is a different issue, a different issue is coming on. At the end, I do not have any such comment and issues on that. But we need to focus on our local capacity building and involvement of local entities and local individuals. Just we are thinking that the person who are coming from outside our country are the expert and they are know everything, and the person who are the expert working in the same area in the country they don't know anything. People are thinking like that. If we change that concept and changing the feeling, thought about the local context, local entities, our indigenous perspective, local feeling, that we can change our concept of colonization to decolonization. Not only in the funding, but also we need to change our thought, feeling, and activity and behavior. Thank you.
Thank you, Anup. What a great way to close us out. Certainly very complicated. We need to change a lot of things. Really trying to prioritize local voices, thinking about the funding architecture, thinking about the way we talk, even the way the language we use, global north versus global south, are problematic. So I want to thank everyone. I know we've gone over, but just a reminder before we close that the webinar has been recorded and will be shared online on the WHO HRP YouTube channel. You will also receive a recording if you registered. We will share these slides on the IBP Network website. You can find more information there. Thank you again for all of your engagement, for our panelists, really inspiring, passionate remarks. I think we were all very moved and certainly learned a lot. And I want to thank our participants as well. There was some really great chat going on, and it sounds like there is quite a bit of interest in some additional sessions like this. So do stay tuned. We'd be happy to organize something in the coming months. And if you're interested in helping contribute to that session, please do reach out to me, Nandita Tate, or my colleague Ados May through the IBP Network. We'd love to have you contribute. Thank you again, everyone, and wishing you a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. It's great. Bye.